This is what the idiots in NATO need to learn. Encirclement does not lead to peace. It leads to war. If you want to get a war, encircle another country, and you will get war. You're not going to get just a capitulation by Russia or Germany prior to World War I. You encircle a country with military alliances, it's threatened. So it's going to act. So don't do that. If you want to avoid a war with Russia, quit moving NATO closer and closer to its borders. So Putin has diffused that very dangerous potentiality for now.
Here's your Dear Millennial story.
Dear millennials, we're sorry. Oh, good.
There's that one. There's this bizarre article where they, the biology of risk, and it's about, like, the financial system and why people are so, like, ready to take on risk, and it, like, explains it, like, the way people get a rush from, like, in the disconnect. It's completely biological. It's ridiculous. Quite ridiculous. 6 years after the financial meltdown, there is once again talk about market bubbles. Are stocks succumbing to exuberance? We thought we had exorcised these demons. You didn't. There was no new regulation. It is therefore with something close to despair that we ask, what is it about risk-taking that so eludes our understanding and our control? And so then it takes it from like a biological standpoint. This is what risk does to your brain, and the chemicals would fire off, and the stress it puts on your body. Like when you ski on moguls. Or when you hyper-leverage someone.
Trillions of dollars.
Trillions of dollars based on crap that you had.
Yeah.
And then you can sell after that.
Like, some people like to ski, some people like to fraud people out of billions of dollars. Yeah, it's just a risk. It's not the financial ends, it's just the risk, the thrill of it, I guess.
You may have an inkling of just how central this biology is to the financial world. Traders are immense in the novelty and certainty of the moment. They step onto the trading floor. Here they encounter the information-rich environment like none other. Every event in the world, every piece of news flows non-stop on the floor, showing up on news feeds and market prices, blinking and disappearing. News, by its very nature, is novel, and puts us in a state of vigilance and arousal. So, overcome with the blinking lights and the stimulation on the trading floor, one succumbs to the seduced, really.
Like a kid in an arcade or something like that.
Yeah, like Aladdin's Castle. Did you have those when you grew up?
Uh-uh.
Oh, it's just an arcade where they print their own currency.
Oh, nice.
How do they get away with it? Tokens.
Yep.
There's like a standard Dear Millennials, We're Sorry article. Miami's gonna be underwater.
You've been seeing like kind of almost cookie cutter articles for various things. You said there's the Millennials article that's popular now. What are the other ones?
Where's my flying car? And that's about like we were promised all this stuff, but we have some technology. Here's the Hillary Clinton.
Oh yeah, there's another one of the article archetypes is the inevitability of Clinton.
Yeah. There is no alternative.
You will be assimilated. Oh, that's even the name of it.
Yeah, that's the name
nice.
of it. There's no alternative. This is all from the New York Times Sunday.
So, with the millennials argument, you see the kind of baiting for generational warfare. With, pitting the old against the young. The Hillary thing is just basically the steamroller of Hillary, even though she couldn't win in 2008. It's all the name recognition against a dark horse candidate.
I don't know. I think Hillary Clinton is doomed. She's such a deplorable candidate. Like, she's no real...
polarizing figure.
Like, she's not a good campaigner.
No.
So, like, the more she has to, like, do that sort of stuff, the more exposed she becomes.
Well, I think that's maybe why they're, like, trying to trump her up so much right now.
Yeah.
Some factions,
Absolutely. There's certainly people that want her to be president. They also have an article on when Madam Secretary made a difference. It talks about her time as a Secretary of State. Lots of stuff in AFRICOM, responsibility to protect.
Yeah.
Sort of, we got to save the Nigerian kidnapped girls, which is one of my favorite stories of, let's pick a fucked up story in Africa, follow that up, and then justify that for like some sort of military intervention to check the Chinese.
Yeah.
There's a really good podcast called the China and Africa podcast that if you want to sort of just be briefed every week about what's going stuff that's interesting stories.
Wow, cool.
About Chinese investment in Africa and how they're running the show.
Yeah. Giving them an alternative to the IMF and debt slavery, basically.
Yeah.
Development, partnership, sharing, 50-50 splits of deals, no interference in the internal politics. That's what China's offering. Of course, we're offering slavery and devotion to, whatever social movements or anything we have going on here for reproductive stuff or whatever else, religious stuff.
I was just looking back to the Hillary article. Sort of apocalyptic in its nature. The last line of it is, "But without her, the deluge." It's the famous Louis XV gravestone from the French Revolution.
Wow, so they think she's just crucial.
She's talking about how
to blocking populist momentum,
and
subverting it.
Yeah,
yep, that's what she's there for.
So, what is the presidential field like? I'm worried about Jeb Bush. Worried about Ben Sass. Worried about Hillary Clinton. Those are like, the people that
the worst possible.
Well, Jeb Bush, he makes me nervous because I saw that like Chris Christie was like sacrificed to the Bush.
Yeah, he was small time. They're like, what is this guy doing in the limelight? Like I wrote up in the 2013 article that if Chris Christie was the hope of the future of your party, you were in serious trouble.
Serious trouble.
Yeah. So getting that guy knocked out was crucial. Let's cover this Zero Hedge article. So recent Zero Hedge article called "The Madness of Crowds and Great Insanity." Tyler Durden writing on Zero Hedge. Never in my 30-plus year career as a market observer have I seen so many out on a limb, which is about to be sawed off. Anyway, it's an article in the typical Zero Hedge fashion. Whole lot of analysis of problems, no solutions. Quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, Minsky, Frédéric Bastiat, John Wolfgang von Goethe, Gautier. That's the band. more from Bastiat. Of course, George Carlin. Nice little sprinkle of Carlin in there is always good.
Can I talk about this Nietzsche quote?
Sure.
It's this quote is: "In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule." Really? Is that what human history has been? Just as
insanity
in roving bands of insane people?
Not even just stupidity, but total like Mad Hatter.
Yeah,
cuckoo bird.
This is sort of this apocalyptic view that many libertarians use all the time as a way to, ring their own bell. And it's just anti-historical. I mean, most times when people get into groups, they usually work together. Sometimes, and a lot of times, especially in early history, they fight each other.
Just depends how educated and how knowledgeable and how active the community is. It always would differ between different groups. But starting off an article with the Nietzsche quote, generally not a good sign. The quote should say, "An individual's insanity is rare, but in my own experience, I have syphilis." Maybe that'd be a better quote from Nietzsche. It's like my brain is being rotted out by syphilis. And
There's also this sort of negative view of humanity in general.
I want to go in there and like paste up Nietzsche quotes, but like change a line or two. Be like,
Mad Libs for Nietzsche.
Yeah, that'd be pretty good. Because like one of the ones I was saying,
and death.
Yeah, your two options. One of the ones I was saying earlier is that Nietzsche was saying, you in cultures that are in decline, like the art is always better or something like that. In my crotch itches, because obviously I don't just reference it all back to the STDs. Go for the lowbrow humor with Nietzsche. Tocqueville, so he's saying, the guy from Zero Hedge, he subscribes to all this libertarian-esque ideology, and so there's no solutions in that world. Between the two worlds that he kind of orbits in my readings of him, it's a world of finance and a world of libertarian ideology. And in those worlds, there are no solutions at all. You're doomed. So you're never going to find solutions from this guy. Here's something else he's in the same article called The Madness of Crowds and the Great Insanity is the name of the article. Later, and he quotes Elise de Tocqueville, "It is not an endlessly expanding list of rights. The, quote, right to an education, the, quote, right to healthcare, the, quote, right to food and housing. That is not freedom. That is dependency. Those are not rights. Those are rations of slavery, hay and barn for human cattle." Wow.
Yeah.
So to say you have a human right to healthcare and food and housing and a human right to education, somehow that's not an increasing level of freedom and access and equality, but somehow slavery? That seems pretty completely upside down.
Yeah, absolutely. Ask somebody who doesn't have any of those things.
Yeah,
no education, that has nothing that else they couldn't have learned on their own through their own, intellect, starting from zero. So
that's starving and homeless.
Yeah, this homeless person. See how free they feel.
Yeah, if their freedom to not having those things is that's like one of the most poor defensive arguments against progressive reforms. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just like blatantly out in the open, really.
Well, let's flip it around. If they had the rights to an education, okay, so you're educated, you have a right to health care, so your health needs are taken care of. You have food and you have housing. So what does this person have to do this person can essentially live life.
Mm-hmm. And they're free to do things other than just tending to their own basic human necessities of life, which gives them more liberty, more freedom, and more power over their own destiny. So how is that not more freedom? But it's saying that somehow this is going to be like rationed to you and handed down to you from some kind of...
Like the island. Remember in the beginning of the island?
Mm-mm.
They're all in their onesies. Mm-hmm. And you have like your cafeteria and you have your healthcare.
Uh-huh.
You have your entertainment. That's like the science fiction dystopian future that libertarians like to create, like the state in charge of your entire existence.
Right.
But you have all these...
feeding you out of their hand, and you have to submit to them.
Like the big old bay screens. That's your education. Now, if you have strong unions, strong social groups of people that are light in self-interest, education, but have it be like free education.
Mm-hmm. You're not saying that I demand this authoritarian government to give me these things. You're saying we're going to structure human society in this way that can deliver on these things that humans need to live and that humans need to improve their life.
So, and not through some utopian, Rousseauian idea of getting back to nature, and you have these noble farmers, these patriarchal institutes.
Well, and wars.
Libertarians like to go back to 1776 mythology, like the romanticism of colonial times, of like this was the perfect time to be a person, when it really was, much more Hobbesian than today.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where they're coming from. That you have none of these rights, and any of these rights, someone trying to influence, put these rights into place. Put these rights into place. That's an attempt of slavery.
Really upside down thinking. But when you look at how the extent that the oligarchy goes to deny these rights, so they can be the biggest, so they can continue to dominate the society, wars have been started over less. Even just some of those rights. Even just look at how Truman was installed into the presidency after FDR, and the launching of the Cold War was done to prevent a Russia-U.S. condominium or joint commonality of interests to industrialize the world and to destroy the British Empire, basically dissolve their authority over Africa, India, the whole Oceania area. The Cold War had to be launched to stop that era of progress in human development. So when these oligarchs don't want you to have access to healthcare and education and food and housing, it's because their irrational privilege in a rational system of domination of the society is totally predicated on those things not existing. Mm-hmm. Because if a population is educated, well taken care of, and not desperate, starving, shivering in the cold, and you don't have this underclass, this slave class to perpetuate and use as a battering ram against the middle class to parasitize more of them and use them as imperial conscripts to go fight wars all over the world, like you see with Appalachian people or just inner city youth in this country,
Yeah,
then you lose your power. You have to have the slaves in order to maintain the social domination. So if you're trying to do something to erode their slave army, or they're just underclass, you're trying to take away their underclass, it's like trying to steal slaves off their plantation, right? They would shoot you for that. So this is how this stuff is actually taking place, and why these people go to these gymnastics of language and thought twisting to try to say that you shouldn't want these things that you want. Like,
you want free healthcare.
you do.
Free, like, I say free, I mean 1% Wall Street sales tax paid for all trades of $1 million or more.
You might think you don't, but that's just some kind of stupid thought in your head. If you're bleeding on the street, you're going to want health care.
Yeah, you don't want to have a
You're gonna want
$50,000 ambulance ride.
Who's going to say, "Oh no, don't leave me here. I don't have health insurance. I'm going to die on principle to prove the Austrian, so Mises can and Hayek can smile upon my soul." Or food and housing. You're going to want food if you're starving, and I guarantee you. And in education, well, that's a little more tricky to sell, but you can see how these are all kind of the same thing.
Here we go with Henry Hazlitt on envy and Marxism. The whole gospel of Karl Marx can be summed up in a single sentence.
Oh, and to clarify, this is another quote from this more apocalyptic Zero Hedge article. Mm-hmm. So just later in the article, he says this.
I'm going to start over.
Yeah.
The whole gospel of Karl Marx can be summed up in a single sentence. Hate the man who is better than you are. Never under any circumstance admit that his success may be due to his own efforts, to the productive contribution he has made to the whole community. Always attribute his success to the exploitation, the cheating, the more or less robbery of others. Never under any circumstance admit that your own failure may be owing to your own weakness, or that the failure of anyone else may be due to his own deficits, to his laziness, incompetence, improvidence, or simple stupidity. Alright, now, let's say that's true. Now go die. Now go not have any of these. Don't have education. You can't, if you have kids, they're not going to get educated, so you're going to continue this cycle. I think it's, in the 1870s, there was tons of exploitation going on of labor.
Sure.
Like, really, really blatant stuff. And to use it in this article as, just ignores the entire side of history of, what it was like to be a worker not that long ago. And then this is not a quote this is a quote directly from the writer Tyler Durden, not from. And the next line is, "This is a form where progressives derive their power."
This is from where progressives derive their power.
As this is what the public is taught in public schools. They are a generation of unaccountable victims. Government does not create prosperity and wealth. It destroys prosperity and wealth. Correction. It consumes them.
In all caps. So I'd say the first part of this thing with Henry Hazlitt is that this is one of the few things that they might have some meritable arguments on. It's based on jealousy, it's based on envy, and whatnot. But it doesn't look at social structures of class dynamics, historical norms. It's very self-fulfilling, right? So if say, basically is all that he said in that entire Henry Hazlitt quote on envy and Marxism is that jealousy drives communism. And there is a tinge of truth to that, right? But if you're born into a society where the wealth is consolidated in 10% of the population has 90% of the wealth, based on inheritance, based on consolidation, monopolies, cartels, then that system is unjust. So there's no appeal to justice, to fairness, equality, and human dignity and things like that. It's jealousy, right? So petty emotions dominate humans. And any kind of higher ideals, those are just masks for jealousy, but not talking about greed. The people that have these huge ego trips by owning all this money, having all this authority, and what about their excesses? Aren't those to be more watched and wary? And shouldn't we try to curb them because they're the ones with all the power and the ego and the just out of control megalomania? So what is this? It's looking always downward at people with less privilege, less access, and saying, "Oh, you're the problem," rather than the people with the power, with the access, with the authority, the ones that actually shape the society. Totally backwards. But that's why Henry Hazlitt exists. He's a total sophist for the big money powers. He wrote for the Post or the Times.
I don't know.
One of the two. Back in the day, one of those bastions of post World War II, neo-Nazi sympathies, holdovers, and of course. "Quote unquote," Tyler Durden, writing for Zero Hedge, He's been writing about markets for 30 years, meaning the guy is definitely 50 years old, if not 60 years old. So he grew up in a different era, and he, grew up in an era in which prosperity was way more abound. And this kind of the millennial question, right? Like, these people believe this stuff more because it applied more to when they were growing up. Like, you could actually go strike it out on your own, seemingly, because the society was set up, oriented towards progress, human development, prosperity, equality.
If he's been doing this for 30 years, I wonder what his student debt was.
Yeah.
What, $6,000 for Tyler Durden?
Oh, yeah. He's like, I paid a lot for working in school, but these damn kids nowadays...
So lazy at taking their pills and...
Yeah, and then the government does not create or prosperity or wealth. It destroys prosperity or wealth. Correction, it consumes them. So Tyler Durden on Zero Hedge claims to be a financial analyst, but does he not know that there's this country on the map called China with 1.2 billion people, with the second biggest economy in GDP terms nominally, but actually probably in physical production terms, the biggest world economy now? Mm-hmm. Do they not exist with their dominant state position, which actually was borrowed largely from the American system, which we used to have, where we had this growth, where we had this rising standard of living? So it's just total ideology. So when it comes down to picking between his financial analyst position or his ideology, here he's picking his ideology, neither of which is useful, right? So this guy clearly doesn't know that much about history.
Yeah,
and he's selectively picking things in the contemporary context. Because how could he even say that and acknowledge that there's a place in the world called China that is what it is, that has a really dominant state position, that is intent on rising standards of living, like we covered in the last article, saying that they, as part of their next 5-year plan, intend on increasing wages 13% every year, right? So where does that factor into this liberal nonsense he's puking out here?
They are a generation of unaccountable victims. Government does not create prosperity wealth. It destroys prosperity wealth. Correction, it consumes it.
Yeah.
It's so anti-historical.
So they haven't been victimized. Yeah, so even in those two sentences, he's saying that these people the modern people growing up have the mindset of Henry Hazlitt on envy and Marxism. But then he's saying this is where progressives drive their power, as it is what the public is taught in public schools. They are a generation of unaccountable victims. So he's obviously saying that sarcastically. He's saying, you're taught to be an unaccountable victim, but wouldn't the teaching and the indoctrination of teaching people to be unaccountable victims actually make them victims? Don't you see that?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely.
So he's already implicitly contradicting himself just within two sentences.
Straight on is that the world is ending. Mm-hmm. He's always there with that.
Yep, of course.
And that he doesn't have any solutions for this thing other than, these damn kids today shaking his fist.
And, you damn kids, get off my lawn! I'm Tyler Durden. I use something that sounds cool as my name, so you kids pay attention to me. This guy's incredibly overrated. Like, if you want to get some kind of financial analysis from him, it's a pretty good place to go.
Yeah, sure.
But
you can get some stuff from here.
Yeah, but in terms of solutions or historical awareness, clearly, this guy, Mises,
the last
Adam Smith, Hazlitt, more Hazlitt, Tocqueville, Bastiat. It's like I'm looking at the shelf of my small library I own, and there's a whole section devoted to libertarians, and it's literally all those people.
Yeah,
I just listed just right in a row. So that's like one tiny quadrant of all the books I own, and that's all he's quoting because they're all the same vein. And if he's trying to describe the world, you'd think that he'd be reaching out to other maybe ways to view the world, but no, it's all neoliberal or just classical liberal thinkers kind of reconstituted into a modern context, and then smattering of others. Anyway.
The conclusion is firmly on the horizon. Let's call it the great insanity, all in caps. I don't want to yell it. I believe this version is the greatest in history and will be written about for centuries. More soaring rhetoric. Those that forget history are doomed to repeat it. And this time is no different. He didn't put that in quotes. Okay. However, there is always a great opportunity with great danger as the greatest transfer of wealth from these who hold it in paper to those who don't. Also gold. Gold, get the gold in there. That gold is underway and there's nothing that can stop it. The sociopaths and elites have no ability to turn the ship of state around as our policies have created the collapse. While this is a man-made disaster, it is most definitely the greatest opportunity in history for those that see it and adjust their behavior accordingly. Don't ever forget, they will print the money.
Yeah, that's in caps and bold.
And bold.
Yeah, so there's probably like a German word, one of those great like compound long German words that means like bloated rhetorical writing while feeling senses of doom or something like that. Mm-hmm. I would like to know what that word is because this guy just sums it up. He's like, I'm feeling specifically doomy today. I'm going to go spew a bunch of garbage on my website and then whip up the hysteria.
So this hysteria, this is what he's saying. He's using bold in capitals, and this is one of the sentences. The sociopaths and elites have no ability to turn the ship of state around. Now, I agree with him there. I don't think the ruling class is going to be able to do this. I mean, not on their own. I think it's going to take a lot of pressure from regular people.
Mm-hmm.
As their policies have created the collapse. True. Well, this is a man-made disaster. True. It is Then there's no part on how to fix it.
Almost the whole problem of the article could be seen in the first half, the first sentence of the article. Never in my 30-plus year career as a market observer. Key point. This guy's not an activist. He's not a leader. He's not someone that's providing solutions. He's not an organizer. So Obama as a community organizer, quote unquote, if you're not buying into that, kind of quaint mythology, has done more than this guy. Observing does nothing. So if you're, going to be an armchair observer of geopolitics, there's no point in that. That's not what we're trying to do here. You're trying to get awareness of the system because changing and inoculating public opinion changes the landscape. But you have to have it always in the context of a solution. Problem, what is the answer? What is the solution? How do we move past it? If you're an observer, he's totally fine with just saying problem, no solution, don't organize.
Guns and gold.
Yeah.
And
you just do everything you're
see you on the other side.
See you in hell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. All right, so enough of this. So, to segue from that Zero Hedge article, here's a great case of why public opinion matters, and why, in being an observer and a commentator, if you're not providing solutions and you're not trying to dispel myths, but rather you're buying into prepackaged ideologies like libertarianism, which is a mythological system that's, you see how it just hamstrings people. Like, that he can see these economic problems, Tyler Durden from Zero Hedge, but he won't be able to talk about solutions or develop any kind of conceptualization to get out of the mind of finance and classical liberal thinking to move humanity forward. There's none of that. So within that framework, you're fucked. You can't do anything. But here's a thing from The Economist. Obama's green gamble. The president's new climate rule will change America. He hopes it will change China and India too. Well, then I don't know what he's smoking if he thinks that. But anyway, it talks about shipments of coal mining in the Powder River Basin in Montana and Wyoming, the EPA, the regulating sulfur dioxide. Then it talks about gearing up for emissions regulations, EPA regulations, but it's not what they want, which is cap and trade, which create a new speculative layer of financial, artificial, fictitious assets, derivatives, and all kinds of new finance capital can flow into those things and jock those up and get a profit and all that kind of crap. This is why public opinion matters, right? So, because when Obama needs some kind of red meat to throw his base to maintain an approval rating, he's going to go to these go-to issues that are concocted to let air and steam and pressure out of the various social factions that exist. So if you are a captured leftist and you're thinking all these traditional ways that you've been oriented to think in, then you're fine with him never moving anything on the economic front, because if he's doing something for carbon emissions, then that's what that's part of your platform, and then you're totally fine. Like, oh, look at him go, like he's trying to do something. But imagine that scapegoat, that pillar not being there, right? Imagine some of these other pillars to release political steam were not there. That would have to be routed into something that actually did something to improve your life, to improve the human condition. That's why public opinion matters, because they can keep leaning on these things. So if Obama has dips in approval rating or he gets beat up in the press a bit, he can relay that back by having some kind of new gun control measure or having some kind of new carbon emissions regulation. And there's not many others than those two, because anything else would actually require populist economics. Actually, he recently endorsed the Elizabeth Warren thing. Yeah. So you can see that if things like that get traction from the bottom up, and people push them and elect populist leaders to get those things going, then the president will latch onto them. Because he knows
he needs something.
Yeah, he knows a good thing that's going to boost his approval rating when he sees it, and he's not able to do it. But if something else is going on, he'll hop on that train, right?
Yeah.
So you see the imperative to push populist economics, New Deal economics, from the bottom up, because then a opportunist president like Obama will jump on that boat. So I'm just saying that, like, when you're talking about zero hedge and stuff like that, systematically dismantling some of these ideologies is really key. Just saying that, like, that's even a strategy kind of just on the analyst commentator level in which you can participate in, right? We're not actually, at rallies organizing people, strikes, demonstrations, but you're even dispelling these bulwarks that always provide an out for the political establishment to not deliver on economic demands. And by getting rid of those things and weakening those positions, just through the context of, in the form of public opinion, those become less and less tenable, and they'll have to actually deliver, bring home some bacon. A few other Economist articles to touch on briefly. Another article here, The Perils of Candor. The Economist is basically just coming out and stating what I've been stating for a while, which is that the goal of the past China policy in the West has been to kind of open a door to them, say, we will bring you on as junior imperial partners as long as you liberalize your markets, deregulate, open up free trade, take off your quote-unquote firm grip from the economy, and basically arrest societal progress. And then you can join this thing, and we'll quit menacing you. So it's like surrender now, and then therefore we won't have to have any antagonism. Is really the offer that was previously made to China. But now they're realizing that that's just not going to work. They're not going to take the bait. Quote, Western diplomats used to talk about how reforms such as this were the way of socializing China. But China may be losing interest in being welcomed, quote, accommodated, as some put it, by a Western-led club, and may see the whole Shangri-La dialogue, which is organized by a London-based think tank, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, as a microcosm of an old world order that it no longer feels bound to accept. Viewed from China, that order is one in which the West, and especially America, sets the agenda. They let China in, but only so long as it abides by the West's house rules. Other countries can team up to criticize it, hoping to thwart its rise to a great power status.
Yeah, well, this is like when a big whale goes into a casino, they can close the doors on the place. China, right now, with the American, like, being so weak, so hollow in the middle, China's like one of those big whales. If you let them in the casino, they can close the doors on it. There's no way they'll be able to contend with this power. I mean,
meanwhile, far from the discussions in the air-conditioned banqueting rooms of a luxury hotel, China is asserting its claims in the seas around it. There it encounters no resistance it cannot brush aside, for now. It's saying basically the pivot didn't really happen, it was just talk, and as soon as they tried to pivot, there was already upheavals in Egypt, rebuffs in Syria, in the strategic situation, Libya just melting down, becoming a catastrophe for Europe potentially, Ukraine going the way it did. So there's so much pull in different directions that there is no move to pivot. There is very little momentum behind it. The TPP is still stuck in negotiations. As long as we can rebuff, if it does come to a vote, during this upcoming election season, well, post-election season during the lame duck area of increased danger. And if we rebuff it from that, it's going to be pushed even further in the future. So this pivot angle really has failed so far. And they're just kind of reflecting on that.
Yeah, well, they don't have any power. They can't exert power over China. No, the Chinese can just say no.
Yeah, and what are they going to do? It's going to be even more weak than what they've done against Russia. This kind of pro forma, going through the motions of trying to talk about sanctions with really very little follow-up. As we cover here in another article here in The Economist, Vladimir Putin's European adventures, Russia in the West. Quote, as Russia's President Vladimir Putin sat down for dinner with his French counterpart, François Hollande, this week in Paris, one of the two-state dinners in Élysée on the same evening, so that Barack Obama would not have to cross paths with Mr. Putin. Ooh, snub. He might have been forgiven for thinking that the worst moments of the angry clash with the West were behind him. Even as eastern Ukraine sinks into further conflict, European leaders have little appetite for new sanctions against Russia.
Yeah, because they've been following the same economic plan as the United States. They can't. They've got no base. They've got no guts to do anything with.
Basically, if they turn away from the system of liberalized trade that they've developed, then they're way more subject to their domestic workforce.
Yeah.
And they're basically like feeding themselves to the wolves from their perspective. So the maintenance of this free trade system requires them to not have these rows with Russia and not go to blows economically.
But they're so used to military dominance, which is coming to an end, that's how they used to do things. They used to be able to control prices through military force. Now they cannot.
With official meetings fixed with Mr. Hollande and Britain's David Cameron, the diplomatic isolation threatened by Western leaders is not extending to Mr. Putin personally. And France is going ahead with assault ships to Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're like, well,
they need
why shouldn't I? It's $2 billion contract. What, am I just going to chop my nose off here for the pleasure of Obama and Cameron? Who's going to act on it first, right? There's no incentive for them to act in coalition with each other. So if any of these countries wants to go to the edge with Russia just on the economic thing, they don't get any benefit from it. It's just totally self-destructive to them.
And isolating Russia, they just signed a $500 billion deal with China.
Now there's other news of China talking about another deal that will actually take the gas bound for Central Europe, and they'll take that too. They're like, oh, okay, if you're being threatened with this,
absolutely.
We'll take that off your hands.
No problem.
Yeah, we appreciate that. But energy sources that don't go over a sea route, a sea lane that's going to be controlled by America, sign me in. That's how the Chinese are looking at it. Anyway, to continue. In Ukraine, Mr. Putin may also presume he is getting what he wants, even if Moscow is not directing day-to-day fighting in the East. Well, that's a change from this magazine's point of view. They were saying before, Putin's inferno, and he was masterminding every single thing that was happening in the east of these countries. Ukraine's newly elected president, Petro Poroshenko, who will be inaugurated this weekend, is inheriting a messy and intractable conflict that will divert attention and resources from other problems, not least a floundering economy. Financial woes and the need to end the fighting will force Mr. Poroshenko to deal with Mr. Putin, though the reverse is also true, since the Kremlin will have to accept Mr. Poroshenko as a valid interlocutor. At a minimum, Mr. Putin and the separatist forces in the East, inspired and in many cases supported by the Kremlin, even if not run by it, have created facts on the ground that make the present prospect of Ukraine joining NATO impossible. So that has changed a lot. They were saying, Ukraine should get into NATO. Problem is, with this destabilization on the border of, the areas wanting to be autonomous, not wanting to be crushed by the IMF, the austerity diktats, in a situation so unstable, to try to get that country into NATO would mean an immediate war with Russia. Because you're basically signing on to this bowl, this is bucking around and saying, okay, you're in our defense pact, when you are actively hostile in your own country and engaged in a civil war. So I think the West are realizing, okay, well, we've deprived Russia from incorporating Ukraine into the Eurasian Customs Union that Belarus and Kazakhstan and Russia recently just founded. That's a huge win for them, So maybe they're just willing to accept that much of a victory.
Well, I think it's a short-term victory because once the fruits of that coalition, the Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russian coalition, and Ukraine's under IMF dictatorship, I think they're going to go back to the Russian side.
Yeah, but for now, from the West perspective, this is why they've kind of moderated their rhetoric, is that it looks like they're winning. As it stands right now, that is true. But there will be backlash from IMF austerity diktats that this country is going to be put under. So to continue, this was Mr. Putin's most paranoid fear from the start of the maiden protests in Kiev last November. The Kremlin will doubtless push for Ukraine to drop any such aspirations of joining NATO, that is. Beyond that, the insurgency in the east gives Mr. Putin a bargaining chip that can be used to threaten Kiev and ultimately be traded for more decentralization. This is what the idiots in NATO need to learn. Encirclement does not lead to peace, it leads to war. If you want to get a war, encircle another country, and you will get war. You're not going to get just a capitulation by Russia or Germany prior World War I. You encircle a country with military alliances, it's threatened. So it's going to act. So don't do that. If you want to avoid a war with Russia, quit moving NATO closer and closer to its borders. So Putin has diffused that very dangerous potentiality for now. So, and now the inertia will start tipping in their direction, and we'll probably hear more hysterical things in the near future, Syrian-esque things like the West says about Syria, about Ukraine when it starts going the other direction, and the people probably, maybe even some of the neo-Nazi controlled areas are like, wait a minute, this IMF austerity stuff really sucks. So that's the main point of that. And the other part of this Ukrainian NATO situation is Poland and America, troops in. Barack Obama promises to increase America's military presence in Eastern Europe. Poles can be prickly, especially when it comes to their own painful history. So anyway, Obama and Poland, as a response to quote-unquote Russian aggression, they are increasing their total military spending to 2% of GDP. Not by 2%, but to 2%. So, once again, symbolic, pro forma crap that just gives
allows you to write a headline.
Yeah, and you're like, oh, look at that, okay, it's ratcheting up. Because right now, really, NATO is fighting for its own survival. NATO wants to survive as a way for the U.S. elites to dominate Europe militarily, and for all the bureaucrats in there, and all, of course, even bigger, the military hardware manufacturers that support those people, that want those contracts, that want the perpetuation of arms sales, and new missile systems, and all this wasteful stuff, are what's driving that. And last article from The Economist, free exchange, narrow-minded. A radical proposal for making finance safer resurfaces. They talk about Glass-Steagall, but without mentioning it by name. They don't. It's like invoking Beetlejuice, like
Candyman.
Yeah, Candyman. You don't want to say it 3 times, so they don't actually put it in here. But they're
Glass-Steagall.
No. So anyway, they're talking about how it actually does separate risk and cordons off the most risk-prone section of the banking sector from the more commercial lending side of things, and how, hey, that made a lot of sense. Maybe we should look at that again. This is the kind of shift in mentality you get. They also had, in passing, I'll mention, they had also had another article where they're talking about the whole problem of the prison industrial complex being a social issue. That these people are basically chewed up and spit out by the system, and there's no rehabilitation in getting these people back into the workforce. And this is a huge just burden on the American economy, that you have so many people not in productive activity. So they're talking about that. They're talking about Glass-Steagall. For a magazine like The Economist to be talking about these things shows an atrophy of the power of their prior position, right? In the same magazine that they're talking about, hey, this whole China strategy we've been operating on for the past maybe 5 to 10 years of trying to carrot and stick them into a capitulation for the Western...
To a cage, really.
Yeah. That they're not buying it. They know enough. They've seen through this stuff. So they're not going for it. And in the same magazine that they bring up that, they're saying, oh, Glass-Steagall, not by name, something that separates banking functions is practical. So you see how these go hand in hand, that they have to make reforms. I mean, look at Britain itself. Britain has basically done away with the hardline austerity governments and are doing things to have a better economic system of growth in the EU than practically any other government. because they're manipulating things in that direction because their position is that weakened where they have to act in those ways. The point of that is the power of the ruling class is not infinite. They can be attacked, weakened, and you see it. You see it in the publications that they're in a position of weakness for having to talk about these things. They would have much rather had China join the fold as a junior partner. That didn't happen. It's not going to happen. In the same magazine, they're saying, oh, we're not going to get Ukraine into NATO. Oh, Glass-Steagall, maybe we should think about it again. Oh, the prison-industrial complex, this is a problem. So you see what I'm talking about here, is that their overall position weakens, and then that's how you get some of these progressive reforms past them.
Something to watch for in the coming weeks is the World Cup. They're having real issues with, I'm sure if you're following, those sort of strikes that are going to go on during this sporting event, this, $11 billion most expensive World Cup ever, while the city that they're holding it in is literally crumbling around them. It has a third world city. It has areas that have running water, and it has areas that don't have running water.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the media. I got the New York Times Sunday thing, and they have their New York Times Magazine.
Is that the whole sports section?
It's the World Cup issue, so it's got a 20-page big article and everything, talking about the stars and what to watch for and whatnot. But when they talk about the people, of course, it's the happy natives, I guess, dancing here, there in the favelas, and they're doing their disco nights, and look how free they are, and got their dance fighting. And so it'll be very interesting to see how the petty bourgeois media deals with this populist uprising, and it's going to go on in Brazil during the World Cup, during this being when the eyes of the world are on it.
Wow, that's the thing they built for that?
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, that's huge. The protests outside the Roman Colosseums, Our empire's collapsing here. Does anyone care? Yeah. Or just more bread and circuses, of course.
We're listening to the China in Africa podcast now. This is a really interesting podcast about Chinese foreign investment into Africa. What it means for the West is something that's often brought up. What it means for Africa, the sort of chessboard that Africa is becoming between China and the IMF, really, and China's ability to create infrastructure, create jobs, and things like that. It makes it a much more attractive suitor than the brutal austerity of the IMF.
Yeah, so there's already a global competitor to the IMF, and I've known that this has been going on between, the Chinese interests will come into an African country, make them some kind of equitable deal, and the IMF basically can only offer usury, debt slavery, and speculation, and, imperial
resource extraction.
Yeah.
Refining capabilities of any type.
Not lifting the population out of poverty with water and electrification projects. Let's check it out, Let's see what's been going on in Africa and China.
Good afternoon. Actually, good morning to you today, Gobus.
Good morning.
Usually we're recording a little bit later in the afternoon, so you've thrown me off here a little bit. But let's start today talking about Li Keqiang in Africa. So he's been on a four-nation tour. He stopped, first he was in Ethiopia, then he went to Nigeria, then he went to Angola, and he finally ended up in Kenya. And it's been an eventful week in the China-Africa space. We've Li Keqiang in Africa. So he's been on a four-nation tour. He stopped, first he was in Ethiopia, then he went to Nigeria, then he went to Angola, and he finally ended up in Kenya.
Those were all former European possessions: Angola, France, Ethiopia, Italy, Kenya, Britain.
And it's been an eventful week in the China-Africa space.
Nigeria, United
has
States.
Tons of articles, no shortage of articles to post on our Facebook page. But today we're going to look back at the trip and kind of what it meant. Cobus, what we're going to avoid doing is doing a kind of play-by-play of each deal that he went through and the minutia of it, because we covered that pretty extensively in the preview of the trip. What I'd like to talk to you about is kind of give me a broad overview of what he accomplished on the trip, and then I'd like to go into the trends and kind of some of the themes that we can pick up from his visit. So give us some of the highlights, if you will.
I think the first one-liner would be that he managed to position himself even more intimately in the context of African development. So two of the big kind of numbers that actually surprised me is that he promised to quadruple investment Chinese investment in Africa to $100 billion and to double trade volumes to $400 billion. So, I mean, those are pretty big promises.
Hold on, let me interrupt you. Let me put one more impressive number that came up during it. 50% of all China's foreign aid, he said, is going to be committed to Africa as well.
Yeah.
So that's another impressive number.
Yeah, it's very impressive. And he threw himself into kind of specific kind of projects, for including a project that's been pushed for a long time in Africa to set up a big cross-continental high-speed rail system. That he expressed support for that. He said that they're going to set up a research and development center for that. He expressed support of regional aviation, and then kind of general a heap of other deals. So
Africa is soon to have a better rail transportation system than the United States.
Courtesy of China. You can see how a continent like Africa, after centuries of colonial rule and imperial domination, a natural fit for China to want to reach out as an ally to this country, as China has suffered under nearly 2 centuries of colonial domination. So forging these ties between China and Africa will provide them, as these countries are lifted out of poverty and become, potential centers like new South Koreas, new Japans, new things of this nature, new Taiwans, will be a great strategic move for China over the next, century, really. Build up their allies now, and in 20, 30 years, these fruits will be reaped, and they'll be large. This is, what a real investment in other countries and real partnership can bring. And also that whole corridor of resources, minerals, potential energy deposits, things like that.
It's interesting that from the beginning, the foreign ministry was underplaying resource deals. Particularly kind of commodity and mining deals got almost no mention. Compared to that, there was a lot of discussion about these kind of like kind of infrastructure kind of deals that's going to move African development ahead as a whole.
Well, 2 words I think will be the legacy of this trip, and people will remember these 2 words for quite some time. Growing pains. That was a phrase that he used to describe China-Africa relations, and it was I think a brilliant move, in part because it suggested that growing pains it's a great metaphor. It means that things are growing up and maturing and will eventually be strong, but right now are encountering some difficulties. But in some ways it represented a level of humility that you don't really see from major superpowers. And I find it unusual, in part because right now, as we speak, China is engaged in a brutal form of politics right now with its neighbors in Asia, and extraordinarily aggressive. And yet in Africa, we're seeing this humility, we're seeing this humbleness that you don't see in the other parts of the world. So it is very interesting to me to watch kind of China's global diplomacy in action right now. The confrontation going on with the Japanese and the Vietnamese in the South and East China Seas versus a humility about growing pains in Africa. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd have issue with calling it extraordinarily aggressive. You call extraordinary aggression some brushes. Extraordinary aggression would mean like war and actively fomenting violence. It's a far cry from that. And a lot of this is an abreaction to the pivot, to riling up Vietnam, riling up South Korea and Japan against China. So when you do that, you create a counterpressure. And now they call that extraordinary aggression. It's once again like the people that just fell onto the scene with the Ukraine situation after it already happened, telling everyone what was going on, telling people like myself who had been already looking at it for months and months what was unfolding on the ground when they just got there and didn't know any of the backstory, right? So
yeah, it was even more kind of interesting in the context of all of the other state visits that happened almost at the same time as his visit. So Kishida Fumio, the Japanese foreign minister, was in Africa recently, and then obviously John Kerry was also there. And it was quite interesting, as you pointed out, that the humility of the growing pains metaphor stood in interesting contrast with Kerry, who who pledged, for example, help to run the DRC's coming elections, and then also kind of took time out to say that that they would prefer it if if the current leader doesn't run again. So, kind of it's interesting. Kind of America seems to be a little bit stuck in this kind of talking from above kind of role, whereas China, I think, is very efficiently and interestingly positioning itself on the ground.
Well,
Just because America doesn't really offer anything. They're not offering
A better deal.
Yeah.
Like, we'll sell you that maglev train system at a better price with a better technology. No, nothing like that.
Kind of from the bottom up.
it's funny that you bring up the comparison to Kerry versus Lee, in part because they did overlap their tour there. And I go back to the interesting prospect that Howard French put out on Twitter, suggesting that what an impact it would have been if Kerry and Lee showed up in South Sudan together. But in hindsight, to your point, the tone of each of these leaders is so different from one. And they represent completely different countries and agendas, of course. But as you said, in the DRC, Kerry openly communicated that he doesn't want Joseph Kabila to run again, which the Chinese would, I think, be horrified for, because that, of course, is the intervention in the internal affairs of other countries that they really want to stay away from for the most part, the civil and the political side. But it was a nice contrast to show the different approaches. Let me,
Almost one is based on development, and one is imperialism.
Yeah.
Imagine the arrogance of a Secretary of State coming from, like, China, or just some kind of premier of China coming over here and saying, Obama, I don't want you to run again. Or XYZ senator or House person, I don't want you to run again. All, of course, under the auspices of threat, destabilization, fomenting violence, cover revolution, Boko Haram style terrorism. This is the menacing and the aggression of the U.S. This is how far our international relations have fallen. This is all we got to offer. Threats.
Let me ask you one question about the public diplomacy and the communication side of it. You and I have never been very complimentary of the Chinese in their ability to effectively communicate on a PR basis. It seems to me on this trip that they did a pretty good job. That is, in the run-up to the trip, they set the expectations of what he was going to do.
Well, also realize when they're talking about PR basis that you're living in a Western media bubble. So I'm sure that how it looks from the Chinese perspective of the Chinese people looks a lot different. It's just saying that, like, oh, they're never able to make a good PR move. Well, you live in a Western imperial establishment where every single tiny move they make is hyper scrutinized, and
they have no development plan, so they have to be squeaky clean on their presentation, so they don't offer anything.
Yeah. So anyway, that explains that phenomenon.
And then throughout the trip, they were effectively communicating along the way, as you said, trying to diversify the message beyond natural resource extraction, to get away from this kind of colonialism message, to kind of put a softer side of China through. And looking back, surprisingly, I have to give praise and compliment to the Chinese Foreign Ministry and even Li himself for effectively getting those messages through.
I agree. I think the visit tended to humanize him, which is difficult with Chinese, high-level Chinese diplomats, because they're so, obviously, it's much less of a personality game than American politics. So we, foreign politics.
No kidding.
Less about these people.
They have development economics, so it doesn't matter about personalities.
They're so sober, always the same kind of dark suit, same kind of hairstyle, and I think they managed to overcome that. I think they managed to actually warm his image up a little bit.
Well, if they warmed his image up, what do you think the response was from the point of view of the African public? Now, obviously, I'm not there. But I can see, at least online, following the major blogs across the continent, following the major media coverage, that I didn't see any dissent. I did not see I saw some critical coverage saying, African leaders need to address X, Y, and Z, but not like when you see, even when Xi Jinping came, there was, anti-ivory and those types of protests that kind of popped up from here and there. Certainly when Obama went to Africa, there was a lot of dissent that showed up across the blogosphere and in the media. There was none here. Why is that? And is that because, in fact, the message that was being conveyed by Lee was in sync with what people want to hear? Or is it because the media isn't as sufficiently sophisticated to report on it? Why do you think that there was such glowing positive news coverage of this?
I would say it's a bit of both of those. Kind of obviously this time he wasn't in South Africa, so the South African media and kind of is stronger on all levels. Kind of including blogging and official media. And also more critical.
Yeah.
So there's that, and then also I think the African media was distracted by the fact that it was the South African election this week. So I think South Africa kind of knocked Lee off some of the headlines a little bit.
And to that point as well, let me interrupt you, but to that point as well, Boko Haram in Nigeria also dominated the headlines. And put Lee in a little bit of an interesting kind of position because, this is an area where they're not used to kind of crisis, communication and whatnot. And so Lee was forced to kind of commit Chinese support as well, along with the United States, to help find the 200-plus kidnapped girls out of Nigeria. But I guess in some ways, with the ANC elections going on and the Boko Haram kidnappings, do you think that helped or hurt? That is, one could make the argument that the Chinese do like to fly under the radar a little bit. And they do like to kind of be a little bit more quiet, a little bit more low-key. So, in fact, if everybody was distracted and they get to do their elite diplomacy, that's just fine. The flip side of that might be, well, they want these high-profile visits to generate the attention, to generate the goodwill, and to really help shift public opinion in terms of their thinking of the Chinese. And so when they get knocked off the headlines, that does them some damage.
They don't need these PR trips to generate goodwill because their economic policy generates more goodwill than any sort of PR stunt ever could.
Yeah.
You know,
all the platitudes you want, can't eat those.
Yeah, there's no irrigation system.
Mm-hmm.
Which side of that do you fall on?
I think it actually helped them because, if in a situation where they're not even the biggest story in Nigeria, during his visit to Nigeria, what ends up happening is, okay, sure, he's not necessarily on the front page, but it also means that there's much less energy to negatively report about China, which means that there is a certain level of reporting about him, but almost all of it is just covering deals and covering kind of essentially positive news. So he ends up being the kind of positive counterweight to the kind of bungling of the Nigerian government, kind of in dealing with Boko Haram. And I think it actually worked out pretty well for him, as far as I could see.
Well, it may have worked out well for him, but certainly the big loser this week in terms of media was President Goodluck Jonathan in Nigeria, who really wanted to use the World Economic Forum as a, as to put Abuja and Nigeria on the world stage,
That does shed some new light on that whole Boko Haram thing. That was timed the same time that the Chinese diplomats were there talking about new trade deals. It says, what kind of threats that are made behind the scene, looks even more to be, without even looking into it, the timing stinks, right? So that, just be wary of that. That every single one of these countries that China moves into to try to make investments, that does make investments and starts building infrastructure, that is going to be the new battleground, the new target for the empire to destabilize. Because they don't want new, South Koreas, new Taiwans growing up in Africa that are Chinese allies. This is a way to deprive China of allies and of resources and of trade partners. So every single time they try to make a move, that's what's going to happen. Luckily Africa is huge, so their ability to do all this while Ukraine, while Egypt, while Syria, while pivoting, while all this other stuff is it has its limits.
This was, I think, the first time that the WEF was holding it in Africa, and he really wanted to kind of, crown Nigeria as the continent's largest economy, and yet at the same time he was overwhelmed by the story of the 200 girls being kidnapped. So that...
Yeah, and I mean, kind of the fact not only that they got kidnapped, because, just in a cold-blooded kind of media spin sense, one could possibly, kind of portray that as his government as kind of bravely fighting against these fanatics. But then the added kind of revelation that the Nigerian government probably knew about the kidnapping before it happened, or the danger of the kidnapping before it happened, and also it just looked terrible.
Yeah, and it allowed Prime Minister Lee to also speak about terrorism, which is something that is very controversial back home. He did issue a few comments on it. China's facing a number of terrorism problems on its own soil. Again, I'm not going to get into whether they're justified or not because that's extremely contentious, but There was another terrorist attack in the Guangzhou rail station just during Prime Minister Li's trip. So he did draw the comparison between it, and it does put, I guess in some ways, China as an equal to African countries in the sense that they're both confronting terrorism. So, okay, there you go, moving on from that. Key question now, which is looking at the foreign press coverage, the international coverage. And to be honest with you, I was also surprised. So I was surprised that the African media was so glowing and positive and not critical. And then I guess I was a little bit surprised that here we are now, almost 10 plus years into the Chinese engagement in Africa. You know, elites in the US, in Europe, have woken up to this to some degree. But to see nothing in the French media, for example, and when I mean nothing, we're talking a donut hole on Le Monde, nothing on France 24, nothing on Radio France International, and the reason why I find this so funny, I mean on borderline hysterical, is that if you actually go inside these organizations, in full disclosure, I was employed by both Radio France International and France 24 when I was the editor-in-chief of the digital group, they are obsessed with Africa. And what's funny when you go to and I mean obsessed, it is really on a level of obsession. But I think it's very important that it's French Africa that they focus most of their attention on. Interestingly, the Chinese Prime Minister did not step into any French Francophone country, but he got no attention. But I think, same time, I was curious, Cobus, to get your take on this, because the French have recognized, at least President Hollande, that now Africa is important to compete with the Chinese, and he's made it a priority to get back in the game there and to even extend French business beyond Francophone Africa. And yet, there was this huge gaping hole in the French awareness of Africa, and it's China. And yet, you would think that there would be at least some analysis, some reflection, and there was nothing. And it's stunning to me how the editorial choices are made in Paris, and yet every little detail of the Central African Republic or Mali or Rwanda or any of these French-speaking countries is covered, and yet the Chinese Prime Minister tours through Africa, and there's not a single story.
Well, it goes to show that imperialism is alive and well in France. And you look at the Syrian chemical weapons attack of, the trumped-up Syrian chemical weapons attack of last year. In August, there was one prior to that in May that the French and the British trumped up, and the Western media didn't quite take the bait on it. I don't know what happened behind the scenes of why that wasn't pushed, or Kerry wasn't grabbing for that one quite yet, or whatever it was exactly, but maybe it was too soon, right? Right after that close after the election, they didn't want to go for it. Whatever happened, but the next one was largely pushed initially by the French and the British. So these are still imperial powers, and they operate accordingly.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, it does make one think that maybe there is a situation where where Africa only really exists in the French imagination as a part of France. That it's almost impossible to think of Africa as an independent place. With its independent needs. And where something recently, like kind of a cross-continental rail system would be big news. That it only exists as this kind of there's the only space for Africa is this idea of it having an umbilical cord to France. Maybe I'm not really part of that world, so I don't really know. But that's a feeling that I got maybe from a bit of a cynical African perspective.
Yeah, I mean Al Jazeera did quite a bit of coverage, so they deserve a little bit of praise. The New York Times did a little bit. The American media
Wall Street Journal,
the print did. There was nothing in the electronic media, in the broadcast media, which is surprising in the sense, again, that this is an opportunity to put the story onto the mainstream coverage just once a year, because these types of visits don't happen very often. And when they didn't happen, again, I just find it surprising. But it's not surprising in one sense, because the worldview of the editors in most U.S. newsrooms and most French newsrooms, just to take two, is extraordinarily narrow. And I speak from 20 plus years experience in newsrooms in both of those countries. So but it's just, why is there such cluelessness even to this day? And well, there you go, and that's why. It's because there just isn't much coverage. If you do a Google News search for Li Keqiang, China Africa, Chinese Africa, any of those keywords, you're predominantly going to find a lot of English language Chinese coverage, so CCTV, People's Daily, English, whatnot. and you'll find a lot of the kind of official African press coverage that is standard media, the Angola news agencies and whatnot. So there wasn't an enormous amount of press coverage that kind of came out of the usual suspects, if you will. It was really much right down the line. I guess in some ways, is that because, do you think it's because it was not the president, Xi Jinping, who did generate a lot more coverage and it was the prime minister? Is it because people were distracted with other bigger stories? Or is it also, let me just throw this one out to you, they're kind of over the story a little bit. He signed a bunch of infrastructure deals, he did some natural resources deals. What's new here?
I would think that, I would raise a fourth possibility is that it might also have to do with the shrinking size of Western bureaus in Africa. It's again go back to the fact that they're also dealing with the South African election and Boko Haram. That maybe they just didn't have the personnel. To follow him. Maybe the one person in Nigeria was busy covering Boko Haram, and they just didn't have another person available.
Yeah, that's
because
possible.
The bureaus have been cut so aggressively that might have contributed to these kind of choices.
Well, I'll tell you,
with all the other ones that you raised.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you just from personal experience as somebody who in Paris just a few years ago, not even that long ago, tried to pitch China-Africa stories, big China-Africa stories, to the editors at Radio France International and at France 24. There was just a wall of, no, they're not interested. This is not a big story. So, at least in France, I mean, when someone like Le Monde, who does have the bureau resources across Africa, doesn't actually deploy somebody from, one of the Marrakesh, from the Tunis, from any of the Francophone bureaus to go cover this, I thought that was interesting. And I think it really does the West an enormous disservice because they are missing out on the subtleties of the evolution of Chinese diplomacy. So my final...
I agree wholeheartedly that, and I think that one of the reasons why there is this media blackout in the West is because of the Chinese infrastructure projects going on in Africa today. If there was news broken out that China did a Cape Town to Cairo, bullet maglev train, the United States is being left behind. Europe and the U.S. are being left behind.
Yeah, it's embarrassing. Like, the China's in there building infrastructure, and all we can offer them is debt slavery and war,
and we can't
destabilization,
in
terrorism.
Our home countries.
So it's just, they don't want to cover it. It's really inconvenient and embarrassing, and, that after hundreds of years of European colonialism on the African continent, now they're getting a helping hand from someone who was also under the thumb of the colonialists in their past. And, it just doesn't speak well of the ruling class of any of those countries, of France or Britain or the United States. So they avoid it. Or if you hear about it, you only hear about Boko Haram or something like that.
Yeah.
You don't hear about...
Or that China's smuggling ivory or something along those lines. Or...
Yeah, always some scandalous thing. Not actually what's going on. It's very, very cherry-picked. So that's why it's hard to even get news. I mean, he's admitting here that, the Western media establishments it's like a blackout. And yeah, it is.
Kind of reflection on Li Keqiang's visit was, I thought it was much, much more savvy diplomacy than I expected. I thought he really was very effective at changing the subject, at engaging, at speaking to the issues that Africans wanted to hear about.
Yeah.
He talked about poverty elimination, about infrastructure development, about wildlife in Kenya, which we didn't think they were going to bring up. He committed $10 million. Granted, that is it's a... $10 million isn't anything, is a drop in the bucket for what they're fighting against, but he took the issue head on. It showed that they weren't insecure about talking about poaching. I thought that...
Well, it's also to play to the Western media, right? That if they're over there developing, the Greens are going to shriek, like in typical Helen Caldicott fashion, those people can't have development. They have to be kept in poverty because somehow... it's less ecologically destructive to have them in poverty, even though the opposite is true. The fact that these people in poverty are much more likely to be poachers, much more likely to not care about other wildlife, right? It's their own survival. So when you get people living in actually industrial society, you have a want to preserve nature. But, choosing between greed and being non-hypocritical, the West and the imperialists always got to choose greed. So, that it's a comprehensive development program over there, that it's for the enrichment of the people of Africa. The tragedy is this could have been us all throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s and onward, and you could have a totally different Africa right now, much more developed, and all in great relations with the United States, because we would have been what China is doing now 70, 80 years later. We could have been that, and we would all be much better off for it.
Yep, a lot wealthier.
We'd be incredibly wealthier. Can you imagine every one of these countries being a Korea, a South Korea, or a Japan, in terms of their productive capacity, the good aspects of those countries? That, imagine what world GDP would be, and rising standards of living, and how untenable it would be for our oligarchy and our ruling class to oppress wages, oppress labor, because all these other countries would be in a position to just pass us up at any time that they did that. So once again, with the British system of free trade back in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, it was all about keeping other countries from developing, keeping them backward. That's the imperial model.
Remember,
that's what we've adopted.
Opium Wars. Only accept silver for opium. No development inside Chinese countries.
Right. Yeah, no contracts, no exchange of anything that's going to develop.
Extraction.
Yeah, right.
Just like in Africa with empires, raw material extraction.
Yep, that's it. That, like Kerry puts it, which we'll be getting into Kerry in a few weeks, that they wanted to make the rest of the world a giant farm and a giant mine, and that's it. Like that, you couldn't even spin wool into cloth, or you couldn't spin cotton into cloth.
Gandhi protested with in India.
So that's imperialism, and that's what is trying to maintain dominance in Africa.
All over the world, really, and it's being rebuffed.
Yep.
Everywhere, and it's about to be rebuffed at home in America.
Yeah, the populist uprising. Look how China fights imperialism, right? It's not fighting it with bullets and guns and bombs and tanks and missiles, because that doesn't work. You're going to lose. It's a system of violence and domination and slavery. It knows violence and destruction really good. It has that down pat. So rather than doing some kind of foolhardy effort to fight it on that wavelength, you fight imperialism by development, by improvement, by technological upshift, by all these things. And that's what China's pushing in Africa. So it's directly combating imperialism. And that's why China is the enemy of the West and all these publications, of the Western ruling class.
Yeah.
We have nothing to lose. I have nothing to gain or lose from China. What they do doesn't affect me. As working people, we have no interest, we have no qualms like the ruling class has against China. I'd rather just trade with them, just like any other nation in the world. What do we have to gain by menacing them? Nothing. It's only for the elites. There's 2 more minutes of this video.
This was a very important trip in terms of the evolution of Chinese diplomacy in Africa, and that they are getting smarter. They are not shying away from the difficult subjects. So he gets in my view, an A- in some respects. I mean, that was overall. And again, I put this out there as full disclosure. I am no fan of the Chinese diplomacy, and I am no fan of the Chinese government in many respects, so I don't say this out of any allegiance to the Chinese government. I'm actually giving you my honest opinion that I think he did a really good job, and the trip should be considered a big success. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think China came out of the trip looking much better than they went in. He established himself as another kind of friendly face, next to Xi Jinping, in the kind of African imagination. And I think his choices of countries were savvy. It was really interesting. It's really. It seemed almost like one doesn't want to overread it, but it seems like a kind of a maturing of Chinese diplomacy in Africa.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, what do you think? We'd love to hear from you. We've been posting updates and discussions on this on our Facebook page.
Cool.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah. You can even see for the interesting information that they presented, no conceptualization of imperialism, right?
Yeah.
Oh, China's over there with development projects, and fair trade deals, 50-50 splits of equity and returns, Kerry's over there telling elected leaders, elected by their people, that he doesn't want them to run again. What could that be other than a threat?
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, once again, developing the conception of imperialism is really useful. And these analysts, if they had a more comprehensive understanding of what imperialism is, would be able to prescribe much more on-point solutions. There's a Russia Today story where the European Central Bank lowered its deposit rate to negative 0.1%.
Yeah, that's also the front story on Reddit Economics. European Central Bank introduces negative deposit rate.
As the continent battles deflation after many failed monetary policy attempts, the bank said more extraordinary tools can be used to prevent derailment of the economic recovery. The European Central Bank cut its main refinancing rate to 0.15% from 2.5%. From 0.15% from 0.25%, and the deposit rate from 0 to negative 0.1%. The first time the ECB has seen a negative rate, and the first time a major central bank has crossed the zero threshold. Exhausting other monetary tools, well, except public borrowing and public credit, of course, because they can't. The bankers won't allow that to continue. Bringing the interest rate closer to zero is a last chance shot at saving Europe from deflation.
Last chance shot. This is it. We don't have any other options. We're going to go to deflation.
Yeah.
What happened last time Europe went to deflation? They got a guy named Hitler coming to power in Germany.
Yeah, I guess that's what they're kind of encouraging.
A bunch of fascists tried to take over France.
Because this kind of monetary policy will not stop the deflation. The deflation will continue because it all gets dumped into the financial aggregates. Like I've said, it's Japanization. Basically, everyone's turning into Japan from the 90s, which you just endlessly pour central bank money into the financial aggregates, and wages go down. Real estate values, well, depending on demographics, that's a different question. But basically, it's all at the expense of labor. Draghi, who said he would do whatever it takes, quote unquote, to protect the EU from economic collapse and save the euro currency, hinted this may be the first of many monetary shakeups at the bank. If required, we will act swiftly with further monetary easing. I don't know if that's the last chance shot or more action. I'm not sure what they're talking about anymore. ECB head Mario Draghi said at the press conference Thursday. Draghi emphasized that the rate change is for the banks and not for the people and savers. Lowering the bank's rate below zero would mean that banks will, in a sense, be punished for keeping money on deposit and not giving out enough loans. Basically, it's making a deposit rate negative, and this is the recipe for disaster. Can you imagine money flying out of that country, or out of that whole region? Basically, it's a hot potato currency now. So, like, if you have money sitting in euros, sitting in a bank, then it's going to be depreciating in value. So you're going to want to trade out of it. So there's going to be a giant line to trade out of the currency, and it's going to cause even more inflation of the currency on the exchange market. But in the domestic market, it's just more deflation because it's all money leaving productive processes. And they say we got to get all the money loaned out, as if that the problem of Europe is that they don't have enough debt, right? Yeah, Europe doesn't have enough debt, so you got to spurn the depositors to fork the money over to forcing more loans out. And plus, like, how much are you going to have on reserve in this situation? So all your money goes out on loan? Well, then you're insolvent. So what about, like, having deposits? That's just a lost... None of these banks actually have deposits anymore. It's just you loan out all of your money. You actually go into debt to all the other banks and then loan out all that money also. And then if you are threatened with going bankrupt because someone comes and withdraws $1 from your bank, you just get some QE money. That's how the higher end players are operating at this day. Anyway, definitely a late sign of something. I mean, that's pretty canary in the coal mine-ish right there.
Yeah, that's something people were talking about a couple of years ago as like doomsday scenario, and we're here.
Yeah, exactly.
It just shows like that they're out of. They don't have any solutions. They're just going to do more of what hasn't worked. lowering interest rates even more.
Yeah, but
More leeches.
You can lower them interest rates even more, but sorry, productive enterprise and jobs and small businesses, you can't have any of this money. All of this money goes to the Wall Street banks and the equivalent of the Wall Street banks in Europe. And then you can borrow from them at 20% and get usured and get totally extracted and parasitized if you want. And then they're scratching their heads of why this model doesn't work. A lot of the debt needs to be written off, and then you need to recapitalize with something that's actually productive, not just endless speculative loans.
I listened to Tarpley on Rents Today, and they talked about a debt conference like the one they had in the 50s when they canceled lots of Germany's war debt. Yeah, that absolutely does seem to happen, something like that. Because a lot of this stuff is just absurd, all this debt that we were carrying as a society.
Yeah.
And who does it serve? Why are we doing this? It serves a very few amount of bankers.
Yeah.
In Wall Street, the City of London, Paris, Rome, wherever they are.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't help society at all.
Yeah.
It's hindering society. And so you cancel some of this debt, and these billionaires stay billionaires, and then you build stuff and you move forward. You explore space, explore the ocean.
The idea of a jubilee, that this debt isn't productive, and the longer we labor under it, the worse off we're going to be, and the more other countries are going to pass us up.
Yeah, and societies have done this before. I remember distinctly in Jewish cultures, they have a debt forgiveness day because societies have known that carrying a bunch of debt, like Hammurabi, in his code of laws, he talks about usury rates and how societies have been able to figure this out before, and if we don't figure it out,
we're doomed.
Yeah.
So, in regard to the whole debt, everyone's in debt. How is everyone in a society in debt? It really doesn't make any sense when you think about it. Like, who are they in debt to? How could nearly everyone in society be in debt? Clearly, there's something else going on here. That you're never able to get out of it. I'm going to give a little preview for a book we're going to tackle in the next coming weeks. Henry Carey's The Slave Trade, and it was written in 1853. He was later Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor. So, to quote, "The apparent wealth of England is, however, great, and it is for the same reason that Rome appeared so rich in the days of Crassus and Lucius, surrounded by people owning nothing, when compared with the days when Cincinnatus was surrounded by a vast body of small proprietors. Consolidation of the land and enormous manufacturing establishments have almost annihilated the power profitably to use small capitals, and the consequence is that their owners are forced to place in them in saving funds, life insurance companies, and in banks at small interest. And by all these things they are lent out, to large holders of land and large operators in mills, furnaces, and railroads, etc. As the land has become consolidated, it has been covered with mortgages, and the effect of this is to double the apparent quantity of property." The financialization of the economy, basically, is what he's talking about. Extra layers of financial assets basically tacked on to what is traded, and then that is deemed as another layer of value, when in fact, physically and practically for human life, it doesn't have any value at all. You could compare that to the derivatives of today. While the small proprietors held it, it was assessed to the revenue as land only. Now it is assessed first as land, upon which its owner pays a tax, and next as a mortgage, upon which the mortgagee pays the income tax. The landowner is thus holding his property with other people's means, and the extent to which this is the case throughout England is wonderfully great. Banks trade little of their own capital, but almost entirely on that of others. The capital of the Bank of England, having been expended by the government, it had always traded exclusively on its deposits and circulation. The East India Company had no capital, but a very large debt, and nothing to represent it. And the example of these great institutions is copied by the smaller ones. Life insurance companies abound, and the capitals are said to be large, but, quote, 9/10 of them, unquote, are declared to be, quote, in a state of ruinous insolvency, unquote. It is now discovered that the true mode of conducting that business is to have no capital whatsoever. And it goes on. Very similar to today, right? I mean, all the companies take on more debt because of the distorted situation that the stock market is in, and corporate governance and corporate taxation. So, like Apple has, tens of billions of dollars, And rather than doing something with that, they basically, in effect, give it back to the stockholders and then go into more debt. So, I mean, it's just wacky things, what are incentivized and what are not, right? And that's just completely the result of political struggle. And the present system we're in is highly, 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 highly stacked in the favor of bankers. There's another story. The staging base for the Afghan war handed over to Kyrgyzstan. So, in another symbolic step toward the exit from Afghanistan, the United States on Tuesday formally handed Kyrgyzstan control of Manas Air Base, once a major staging point of personal and cargo bound for the Afghan war. Maybe it's just a defense of these countries to have their names so unpronounceable in English that they won't be invaded. I mean, can you imagine one of the presidents getting up there and being like, "We got to go to Kyrgyzstan"?
The strongman of Kyrgyzstan.
Maybe that's what kept him safe from Bush between 2000 and 2008. It's like, damn it, Bush, you can never pronounce it. Like, we'll just have to give up.
Iran.
Iran. Yeah.
Iran.
The Egypt elections is pretty. The voter turnout, according to Wikipedia, in last year's election was. In the 2012 presidential elections, they're saying that the turnout was 57.5%. They're yucking it up over Egypt because they're saying that the voter turnout was incredibly low, at like 44%. So, and they had to keep the polls open another day, whatever that actually means, I don't know. But he got 93% of the vote? So, in that case, when someone's running nearly uncontested, and you have a population of about 12 million in poverty in that country, that's pretty respectable for a voter turnout. When, who are we to talk with our 57%, if that's even accurate? Mm-hmm. So, but this is all they can go off of on these publications is, lower voter turnout. That's going to cut into his legitimacy, I guess, of how the Egyptians see him. I seriously doubt it.
Doubt that if he raises their standard of living, if he builds 1 million houses.
Yeah, if he acts on that.
Second Nile, that's.
Yeah, that's how they're going to tell the legitimacy, right? So, of course, in the West, they always want to judge things of, legit or not, based on social issues, based on anything but anything to do with any kind of economic issue at all. Because talk is cheap, right? If I'm going to say I'm going to help you move and I don't show up, that's a lot different than the friend that shows up and helps you move, or the friend that loans you $1,000 or something compared to one that talks about it, or anything like that, right? So someone that's actually giving you material means or assisting you in a material fashion, that is infinitely more genuine. So I think they're going to judge him on those merits. There's a bit of an about face from The Economist here in an article about China and the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. It says Mr. Xi, the existing prime minister, has 3 new social forces to contend with that grew into a critical mass under his predecessor, Hu Jintao. A huge middle class, an equally large underclass of rural migrants, and online social media that enabled discontents to connect and communicate with remarkable ease in spite of vigorous censorship. He can probably prevent street demonstrations from coalescing into anything like the 1989 unrest. Even if the economy were to slow sharply, a couple of years of stagnation might not pose a great threat to social stability. So that's really interesting that they're saying that, because if you've reading between the lines of this publication for the past years in which I've subscribed to it, they've never taken that kind of a realist position that somehow the natural response of lowering economic growth would instantly be for the people to revolt against the government that gave them all that economic growth. That they're going to be foolish enough to be coerced into some kind of color revolution after watching all the other color revolutions unfold, from the Arab Spring to now Ukraine and so on and so forth. The destabilization campaigns, they're well known. These people are educated. Their media actually tells them what's going on in the world. Or if you want to listen to media that's really critical of their government, go to the established media of our government. And if you want to get information that's really critical of our government, go to their government or their establishment media, right? So you can see that there's contending interests here, and they're going to best represent themselves and put the other person in the worst possible light. Doesn't mean that that's necessarily true. You just take that into account of like how to understand what's going on, right? He said, she said. Here's a great statistic from another story on Asia here. Asia as a production hub. 47% of the world's manufacturing is now in the region.
Wow.
That's pretty impressive.
Once they get off the dollar, we're going to be able to convert that stuff to...
Yeah, to domestic consumption in use. And even the effect of using that productive stuff to even ramp up for higher levels of production. Absolutely. Here's a great thing. So, I mean, this magazine's written by a lot of people, so they take different approaches. Anyway, higher labor costs in China are already beginning to bite. In 2010, a Taiwanese firm, Foxconn Technology, suffered a spate of suicides at its factories in China, where over 1 million workers assemble electronic products, including many for Apple. In response, the company raised wages dramatically to protect the dignity of workers, unquote. Its chairman explained. Since then, higher wages have become an accepted fact. According to China's current 5-year plan, the average official minimum wage across the country must rise by at least 13% every year. Wow. Yeah.
Holy crap, that'd be amazing.
Yeah. Can you imagine that here? What's the present minimum wage? Let's say like $8.
Yeah, it's like in Oregon it's like $8.60 something.
So let's say 0.1 through there. It'd be like $1 pay raise every year. And saying that that's part of their national program.
It's a national interest.
Yeah. To raise their labor's wages. Yeah. Can you imagine seeing such a thing from our degenerate elites? Anyway, the next line is really classic. An obvious consequence is that low-skilled, labor-intensive work will move elsewhere.
You can pay these people if you have a functioning economy.
Well, I wrote China's 15% tariff doesn't exist. That is an automatic process. They're saying, well, the reason why China has skipped ahead and cheated, quote unquote, or whatever they want to call it, in going from totally backward to modern in less than 30 years, in like 25 years, is because they did not follow neoliberal economics. Yet it's, these people think in this way and are so conditioned that he's saying, but as soon as your wages go up, all that labor is going to go elsewhere, as if it's just automatic. And as if the same country that's saying it's a national imperative to raise wages by 13% every year would not take action to make the jobs that they wanted to preserve as part of a national interest be preserved. All right, so Hillsdale College. This is a really worthwhile thing to talk about. Hillsdale College is it's kind of a shell organization, money laundering criminal racket, dressing itself up as a libertarian college, privately held foundation in a way. That's, I guess, kind of like the best way I could describe it. I went to one of the fundraisers here in Portland, and it was from a friend that invited me. And it was incredibly fascinating. I mean, I thought a certain, I guess, more maybe naive part of me thought that the kind of radical, right-wing, proto-fascist parts of the Republican Party, that they didn't believe what they said in public and were just kind of pushing that as a smokescreen for their own agenda and their own enrichment and staying out of prison and all those kinds of things.
I think Jared Slonik says it really well when he says conservatives believe, liberals lie. I think conservatives really believe what they say.
Which was frightening to me because I didn't really know that these people were so radicalized. And it's got to its own point where I guess I compare it to kind of like what I call the intelligentsia feedback loop of like the 1840s or 50s in Britain, where, just to make this quick comparison, like when original libertarian ideology was created in the realm of economics, largely by Adam Smith, it was a known fraud. Like it was like created by Adam Smith and the people that financed him for fraudulent purposes. They didn't do it as a kind of bland academic discourse. It was a very politically motivated document, intent on keeping their colonial possessions backward and unindustrialized so they could monopolize them on, make them import the raw materials. They sell them manufactured goods. That was the relationship of colonial states with their parent providers, and that's what they wanted to keep, that yoke on the United States and all their possessions. But anyway, that became kind of a feedback loop, and like J.B. Say, he's over in France and he writes more on this, and Ricardo comes out, and then like John Stuart Mill. And by the time like the 1840s and 50s roll around, like it's so kind of regurgitated within the intelligence community or the intellectual community of Britain, that they actually like believe their own propaganda at that point and like really think that Britain prospered because of free trade. And so they like repealed the Corn Laws. They opened their trade up wide to all comers, total free trade. And so they were believing their own lies at that point, like Hitler did near the end of the war, right?
Yeah.
He started like buying into the race theory and thinking like all this stuff that was for the population. He was so fucked up on syphilis and like all the meth he was doing that he like started buying into his own propaganda, and that's always a bad position to be in. But that's the nature of Hillsdale College. Like that is what this kind of organization it is. One of the examples I said was like these people are like jihadists for tax cuts. They're like suicide bombers for tax cuts. And they were literally, they were talking about like divine right and all this kind of stuff for tax cuts. And they were comparing themselves to the Union Army in the Civil War for tax cuts. And it's just amazing. And they have like, I think like $100 million plus in their endowment. Like all these people basically give their lump, their cash hoard to Hillsdale. Hillsdale has this kind of, they've worked all the tax loopholes and all that kind of stuff with a bunch of other corrupt organizations that are all doing it. And then they provide, like, they have one college that has very low enrollment. It's a small place. It doesn't have a whole bunch of people. And that's like the public service they're providing basically to shelter all these rich parasites, these millionaires, from paying any kind of inheritance tax or capital gains tax. So it's a complete scam. And when you look at like how much they have on endowment, like it's like hundreds of millions or 100 million. Let's just say 100 million. It's around that. And they have like such a small amount of students that it's like in the high hundreds of thousands per student that they have.
Wow.
So it's obviously not about education. That school exists to promote this radicalized ideology that they've created and kind of fostered. But it has really nothing to do with education at all. And of course, it's this place about, it has these radical libertarian notions of like, we're so about liberty and individualism and autonomy and freedom of mind and choice, but they teach a radicalized, false version of American history in which you're going to be tested on believing in these radicalized ideological positions about the Founding Fathers and stuff like that.
Wow.
So if you don't think George Washington was a radical free market, free trade guy, because he wasn't, and he wrote all manner of stuff to the contrary, then you're going to fail their test. But somehow they're about free ideas and free and open discourse. Anyway, Hillsdale really it's a small college. It doesn't it seems nominal. It seems like this kind of small thing, but one of the main guys, the president of Hillsdale College, Larry P. Arnn, which is a demagogue of massive proportions. I've seen him give a speech. They had the whole audience in the palm of his hand. It was such.
We could boo.
He was.
I want to go to a speech.
Yeah, it was interesting. And
I'm going to give this guy demagogue.
Oh God, he's a severe demagogue, but he's surrounded with his fanatical, hysterical followers. That these people are the Tea Party. Like I remember Larry Arnn was saying, like I have all the Tea Party Congress like on speed dial. Like this is the kind of founding ideological one of the sources. I'd say them and like who's the other one, the one that Paul Ryan's in.
Like the Tea Party Express or John Birch Society.
John Birch Society, yeah. It's kind of like a more, I don't know, probably not historically they don't have the baggage that the John Birch Society has, right? So they're more free to kind of rampage around. Anyway, They sent out this newsletter called Imprimis. I get it. I don't know why. I guess I got on their mailing list. But it really is like a manifesto of like the hysterical, irrational position of the petty bourgeois and the oligarchical factions. I guess like semigarchs, you know, kind of like small oligarchs, but they have the same mindset of the oligarchical position. And it's really fascinating to kind of skim because, if I may, the following is adapted from a speech delivered on March 4th, 2014 at Hillsdale College Alan P. Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship in Washington, D.C. A think tank that basically, make sure that they're not paying any taxes at all. And, if these libertarians are screaming about the national debt being a huge problem, and they're, by the same breath, they're working to not pay any taxes, it's just totally hypocrisy. Anyway, Harold Rood, which is a very weird name, a professor of international relations at Claremont McKenna College, who died in 2011, was not as well known as he was influential. A soldier in Patton's army in World War II, he taught his students that war is permanent to the human condition, and that war is better to win, for no one ever had to accommodate a loser. America will always have enemies, he told them, and those enemies will forever be planning and expending their resources to place themselves in a position to defeat us. It would be nice if it were otherwise, as he was fond of saying, but it was not otherwise. It was the way the world works. Right?
Who?
So
who are these enemies?
The tribal primitivism, as if the rest of the world doesn't just want to live their lives and have and be prosperous, but they want to take away what you have, and that therefore you have to, not act in defense, but in preemptive aggression, basically. This is like justifying aggression, survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
This is like...
And it doesn't say who. I mean, if this was this grave, dangerous threat, no names?
These enemies will forever be planning and expending resources to place themselves in a position to defeat us. Really?
Who, though?
Like everyone in the world is that cynical? No one, the general mentality of the human population of the world is to, not just live and let live? This is the position of someone that has lots of money, and they, have trouble sleeping at night because, what if my money goes away? I'm stuffing my mattress with $100 bills, and what if someone takes that away from me? It's the position of someone that's in a position of privilege, fearing someone, the masses taking that away from them.
Ill-gotten privilege.
Ill-gotten privilege, a guilty conscience. You can kind of hear it between the words what he's saying. Yeah.
Because this is bullshit.
Right. And so you're cynically sitting on top of your cash hoard, and you have to think that everyone else in the world is as cynical as you are, because you are, maintaining this position of undue privilege. Just dripping with cynicism and Darwinism, really, which is really kind of ironic, because these people are, they're holier than thou. It's all about God when they're talking, and
fought in Patton's army.
Yeah.
Against fascists who got to power by using the ideology that they're pushing.
Talking about. Yeah, exact same shit, right? So the irony is always lost on these people. Okay, so to continue. During the Cold War, Dr. Rood, R-O-O-D, would demonstrate in his classes, often by reading stacks of clippings from newspapers from around the world, that the leaders of the Soviet Union understood the world in these stark terms, and that they acted consistently on that basis. He would also lecture on technology from German steel production before 1914 to the state of the Japanese fighter aircraft before 1941, and even, curiously, to the maps of America's electrical transmission lines and power plants. It was important, he thought, to understand the strengths and vulnerabilities of a nation. His classes served as an antidote for students who had grown in post-war America, a much-needed antidote because citizens of free nations in peacetime do not historically think in such terms. We today, and our elected leaders, in whose hands we place the responsibility for national defense, are in urgent need of such an antidote because the U.S. is increasingly and dangerously vulnerable, and our elected leaders appear oblivious. So it's organizing society based on an enemy figure, and that you're always going to have a boogeyman that you can trump up, and therefore that's the whole basis of organizing society. It's It's Leo Strauss stuff. It's like Hitler. It's like Hitler ideology, like right out of the book, like textbook Hitlerism.
Yeah, organized society. Also, but he was talking about the strengths of a country being its electricity, all stuff done through New Deal.
Yeah, and it's funny because he's saying from German steel production before 1914 to the state of the Japanese fighter aircraft before 1941. Like, what's with these weird time constraints, you know?
Yeah.
Like, oh, before then we're going to look at, you know, I don't know, it's just like, you know, kind of bizarre. What was he talking about? Probably at the time of 1941, I'm sure the Japanese government nationalized everything at that point, if it hadn't been already, because they're already to war. Yeah, and even curiously, to the maps of America's electrical transmission lines and power plants. Yeah,
that's
Tennessee
Valley Authority, FDR, the arch enemy of him.
Yeah, what was created though, but you know, it sounds like CNN nowadays, where it's like, you know, the terrorists are going to strike next, and like, you know, looking at these weaknesses.
The plane.
It's also like harping on the Soviet Union as if they understood the world in these stark terms. Well, yes, they did, because they brunt the bulk of the casualties in World War II, which was imperially designed from the get-go and was largely designed to destroy them.
Yeah.
So they understood that all too well, because they had all lost friends and family in that conflict, and so they were very grim when looking at the situation of the world and realistic. You know, it's not, of course, this stuff of like this is the oligarchical position of this country. They're still terrified of the communists who disappeared off the face of the earth 25 years ago.
Almost 30 years.
Yeah, almost getting close to. And like the Chinese call themselves communists, but that's just a word. That's like National Socialism being socialism.
So that was the entire article? Is that they...
No. Okay, so to continue. One would think the attack of September 11th, 2001 would have awakened Americans for this foreseeable future to the need to prepare for unexpected dangers. Surprisingly, its effect was short-lived. Two relevantly recent attacks show the problem. The first I'll discuss took place on April 16, 2013 on an electric transmission substation owned by Pacific Gas and Electric in California. One reason it did not get much notice was the other, the Boston Marathon bombing that killed or injured 260 people, had occurred the day before. So so it's mixing injured with killed to inflate that number to 260 to drive more terror and fear. And then it's saying something about a Pacific electrical grid thing. So it's saying, too bad the people of America have gone back to being, not in total terror and fear and anxiety all the time about September 11th.
After 9/11 is the desired state that he wants for society.
Yeah, exactly. This is how you organize society. The people have to be like a rabbit in a cage, thinking it's going to die, having like a racing heartbeat. That's where the American population needs to be. Because the Pacific Gas and Electric, he's not saying that Homeland Security was created, or even this position, if you want to stay within the bounds of the mythology of the 9/11 false flag events, they're saying that damn it, this giant myth that was created in order to create war psychosis to get a massive imperial increase of aggression across the world was not enough, and that people have reverted back to the state of that position. But even saying that, okay, what if you bought into all that? And Homeland Security was doing their job, and therefore we didn't have another 9/11. Well, that's not what's being desired here. It's not saying that, well, thank God Homeland Security exists now, and then we'd be able to prevent these other attacks, which they would claim were other threats that, like the shoe bomber or whatever the hell, all these other supposed things that they run on Fox News every 4 or 5 months. Another 9/11 was averted, that kind of crap. That this is too bad that we're not vigilant. Do we need another 9/11? Basically, is the kind of undertone of this. Surprisingly, its effect was short-lived. That you can't actually have a society based on hysterical terror and fear and death around every corner. That actually doesn't actually work. Society won't function at that level. But that's what they want. That's what the fever pitch of hysteria that these people are apparently desiring. The San Jose attack. Last April 16th, just outside of San Jose, California, a group of terrorists or soldiers operating on American soil attacked the Metcalf transmission substation in a military action aimed at disabling a part of America's electrical infrastructure. The operation began at 1 a.m. when the attackers cut underground fiber optic cables, disabling communications and security systems. 30 minutes later, using high-powered rifles, they began a 20-minute assault on the substation's extra-large transformer and the cooling system that supports it. Police arrived at 1:50, but the shooters disappeared into the night.
How do we know they're soldiers?
To the day, there's no trace of them. How do we know anything? There's shooters. I don't know. Like what's
So some wires were cut and some high-powered rifle rounds were fired into some transformers.
so like
How do you know
what's?
they're soldiers?
I'm just relishing what this guy's going to say.
Sounds
The
like
solution
the
to
George
this.
Clooney heist.
Yeah. What was the damage done?
Was there like a diamond necklace stolen?
Was there a drive for like multiple wars in the Middle East on such an action? Yeah. Clearly not, and it's a criminal action, right? This is like find the people who perpetuated this crime, see what they did. Yeah,
seems to be.
Why the hell were they doing it? How do you know there was even more than one of them? Like, how do you know it's not just two nutcases or like two operatives creating hysteria? Now, how do you know anything without finding out the details of the things? So far, it's just hysteria. Let's see what he says. John Wellinghoff, then chairman of the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, called this attack, quote, the most significant incident of domestic terrorism involving America's electrical grid that has ever occurred. Oh my God.
Well, we're doing pretty good then.
Yeah, that's not too bad.
Yeah, I'll take that.
Obviously, now this is out of quote, Jim. Obviously, it was a professional operation by skilled marksmen. Estimates of the number of gunmen range from 2 to 6, with training in reconnaissance, stealth, and evasion. But the plan went undetected. The casings from the spent shells bore no fingerprints. That the perpetuators have not been caught.
So they've watched the CSI
Suggests
episode.
a high degree of intelligence. Yeah, they know it by gloves. That means that, wow.
So what does this guy suggest?
Damage to the facility forced electricity to be rerouted to maintain the integrity of power transmissions to Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. And repairs took several months. Okay, so this is like two drunk hoodlums that shot at a power station?
Yeah.
Or this is like a like this is like
Rainbow Six style.
Yeah, this is like 8 highly skilled, trained operatives from birth. That are like Manchurian agents that come into the country that like orchestrate for decades to shoot at a substation and then leave the country. Wow. Yeah, that's like they're ex KBG like sleeper cell like left over. This is like the extent of the damage they're going to do to the country to shoot some substations. Okay, what's
a lot
this?
of purple rhetoric.
So far, we hear nothing but hysterical fear-mongering based on, as he says, no information, because he's using words like, obviously, it was professional operation by skilled marksmen, just inciting terror. Okay, anyway. Political response to the attack ranged from an immediate dismissal by the FBI of the idea that it was a terrorist act. So even the corrupt FBI was saying, this is just nothing. Okay. Dash puzzling, given its sophistication and its proximity in time to the Boston bombing. To recognition by a bipartisan but small group of U.S. senators and representatives that defending America's electrical grid is an urgent priority, that there are over 100,000 transformers all sizes through the grid, the destruction of less than 24 key large transformers, which weigh hundreds of tons, are transported by special rail cars, and they're just like building these things up of like, what would happen if these transformers were taken out? They're like heavy industrial equipment. Would cause a catastrophic failure that would black out the United States.
The entirety?
It actually says that. They would cause a catastrophic failure that would black out the United States. Period.
Wow.
Such is the vulnerability of the system. So somehow there's some transformers that will result in the complete wiping out of the grid.
That's like on the razor's edge, constantly trying to drum up this.
I mean, do you not see the blatant, hysterical fear-mongering? So it's saying something somewhere, even though like our power comes from Bonneville, that somehow something around here that could be destroyed would like result in the East Coast going down. Apocalyptic. America's electrical grid is vulnerable not only to San Jose-style attacks, but to electromagnetic pulse attack. Dash, a nuclear explosion in the high atmosphere creating an electromagnetic pulse that destroys electrical wiring and hardware across the affected area. Such an explosion placed over the center of the USA could destroy the infrastructure that distributes electricity to consumers and industrial users in every state except Alaska and Hawaii.
So if there's an EMP attack like in Call of Duty, it'll fuck shit up. So if that happens, it'll be bad.
Yeah. Who's driving? Who's going to do that? Terrorists are going to be able to get a EMP thing into the upper ionosphere.
So far, I'm seeing Ocean's 14. We have an EMP machine. We have.
Here's the premise for Ocean's 14.
Sort of power grids going out so you can like steal stuff.
This phenomenon has been well understood since the 1960s and the Cold War, era nuclear strategy assumed that a nuclear attack on population centers would be accompanied by an EMP attack in order to disable the enemy's command and control system.
Yeah, they do some fucked up shit.
So it's still, this is like appealing to people who grew up in the Cold War, old retirees with lots of money, who still fear the commies, who still look under their bed for commies and pinkos. It's still like buying into the hysteria of like cold. It's mentioning the Cold War multiple times. It's still like this leftover anachronistic position that is just ridiculous.